Welcome back. Let's talk a bit about the structure of the book of Joshua for a few minutes. When you read the first two chapters of Joshua, what impression did you have? I think of these two chapters as sort of a previously on the promised pilgrimage, and he kind of recounts. There's this flashback, a real quick synopsis of what has happened before in order to set the stage for his reader, hearer. And so the first 9 verses serve as sort of a prologue in which the core principles of the conquest are reviewed. The promise of Genesis 13, Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 11 is rehearsed. And then that brings us to our key verses that we read a few moments ago. And this affirmation of Emmanuel with its attendant charge of courage. See, it's quite apparent, I think, that Josh is more than a bit intimidated by Moses' shadow and probably by Israel's reputation. But there's also the factor of the Canaanites. But I'm struck that when Josh was serving as a member of that search committee 38 years earlier, remember? Even though he saw these folks firsthand, he and Caleb were confident that they were not going to be a problem for God. But now, Josh needs an arm around the shoulder and to be told, don't tremble, don't be dismayed, verse 9. To the contrary, he's charged to be strong and courageous, verse 6, 7, 9. On what grounds? He's more gifted and more experienced than Moses. The people he's supposed to lead have been and will continue to live in revival. The enemy has just melted away. The correct answer is no, no, no. Then on what grounds is one expected to be strong and courageous in the face of fear and dismay? Right. Look at the text. Chapter 1, verse 5. I will be with you. Chapter 1, verse 6. I promise. Verse 9. Yahweh, your God, is with you wherever you go. So you see, this passage provides a great example of the Hebrew narrative technique of repetition. You see that I will be with you in verse 5. Where do you find it again? Right, 9b. The charge to be strong and courageous shows up in verse 6 and 7, and then again in 9a. The anticipation of success is in verse 7, and then again in verse 8b. So you see the kind of bookends squeezing in on something? Or in literary terms, do you see a chiastic structure zeroing in on the Torah, the centrality of Torah? Josh is told that it's key to effective transformational leadership. I mean, a consistent, persistent awareness of God's righteous expectation, what God wants, and a consistent, heartfelt commitment to follow through in the obedience of faith. So, after Josh is charged, he in turn charges the congregation. Look at chapter 1, verse 10. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourself, for within 3 days you're going to cross the Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving to you to possess it. They're preparing to enter into God's rest. Verse 13, verse 15. Then chapter 2 reports this reconnaissance mission to Jericho where providentially God has provided someone to help. Now, who was that someone? It was Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who came to realize that Yahweh alone was God, and she put her faith in him. It's interesting that later the writer of Hebrews calls her a person of faith, chapter 11, verse 31. James claims that she was made right with God. Then chapters 3 through 5 reports their entry into the land. Remember, as the priests were carrying the ark, they obeyed by faith and they stepped into the still flowing Jordan River and stopped. And the Jordan stopped too. And when they crossed, they gathered stones from the middle of the river in order to build a memorial at the camp. I think it's interesting, the narrator's date line in chapter 4, verse 19. I don't know if you noticed that. It's the 10th day of the first month. Now, to the first audience, that would have been very significant, because they would have heard mom, dad, maybe grandparents talk about the fact that it was 40 years ago to the day when they were instructed to offer a lamb for Pesach, for Passover, Exodus 12. And now, 40 years later, they're across. Well, they're supposed to take the land. What would you expect a military leader to do next? Right, attack immediately. I mean, you've got sort of a surprise element there. Well, maybe not a surprise, but you don't want to give them a whole lot of time to, muster their forces and build up their defenses. At least if you don't immediately attack, then you would expect the military leader to be having his troops set up defensive positions. What, in fact, does Yahweh instruct Joshua to do? Now just imagine, you're Joshua. What would you be thinking? I think I'd be thinking, this is crazy. At the same time that news of the Jordan crossing is spreading fear in the hearts of the Canaanites, we read about that in chapter 5, what happens? All the males of Israel who'd been born in the wilderness but not given the sign of the covenant were now to be circumcised. So now many of the fighting men are not going to be in fighting shape. But the fear of Yahweh on the part of the Canaanites kept them from a preemptive attack. And chapter 5 ends with a theophany, God's presence, that brings up images of Moses' call at the burning bush. And then in chapter 6, the Lord tells Joshua, it's a done deal. Look, verse 2. I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors, but no battle had yet begun. No walls had fallen. No victory won. So far as Joshua could see, at least. So again, put yourself in Joshua's place as the, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you get these marching orders from the commander-in-chief. Put away your weapons. Call out the Salvation Army Band. We're going to put on a week-long concert with a grand finale next weekend. I can hear Joshua saying, excuse me, Lord, would you please repeat that? Well, when Jericho falls, how's anyone going to explain that? There was no way to explain it other than God did it. Think about that. We'll see you in a bit.